So today we gather in Lenape-Hawking, the home of the Lenape people. Here at Villanova, we sit at the southern end of Lenape-Hawking, which is a territory that stretches up into present-day New York, through the Hudson Valley, up into the Haudenosaunee, into Mohawk and Mohican territory. Since the 17th century, European colonizers forced the removal of many Lenape communities westward into the interior of North America and northward into present-day Canada. Much of this history has been erased in popular memory, particularly by conceptions of colonization in Pennsylvania being peaceful, right, being attached to Quaker lifestyles. So that memory of William Penn and the Quakers has really sort of erased this history of violence in popular meaning. Through these, but of course we know these removals came through violence and through the disbanding of land reservations established in the 18th century for the Lenape. Still, Lenape have maintained and recovered many communities and culture, both here in this region and in a large diaspora. This includes communities nearby in eastern Pennsylvania, state-recognized tribes, the Nanticoke Lenape, the Ramapo in New Jersey, and the Delaware Nation of Indians in the state of Delaware. And it also includes two primary federally recognized tribes, the Delaware Nation and the Delaware Tribe of Indians, both in Oklahoma today. So I encourage you, I just have a small moment this morning, but I encourage you to learn more about these communities, these sovereign nations, and their histories and their present-day communities from their websites, which they write beautifully about, of course, in their own words. I also want to acknowledge the limitations of a very brief land acknowledgement, such as the one I'm giving this morning. These statements really must be followed by meaningful work and learning and sustained partnerships and political engagement. I know that in the next 2 days, we will hear from scholars about many projects that provide excellent examples of this type of work. And I hope that we can use those to reflect on how we might be in relationship with this land and the Lenape who call it home. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney, for reminding us this importance of recognizing this land acknowledgement in all the public opportunities that we have to talk and speak about topics that we're going to be discussing in this conference, which is defending the land. So I want to welcome all of you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for our participants for joining us today. I want to say thank you very much to Miguel, Agnese, and Laura for being part of the organizing committee. It has been great working with you. And also, I want to say thank you to the College of Liberal Arts and Science. We received a faculty research and development grant that allowed us to bring back some of the joy of having people together again in a conference, sitting next to each other, and they provide us for all the support so we can bring our speakers, pay for their accommodations, and do many things connected to the conference that we have been working on for the last months. Let me tell you how this conference was born. It was born from the idea of Miguel and Agnese, who have been teaching courses on environmental studies and environmental literature in the past semesters. They have been working together very closely with the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And also it emerged from an idea that we had in Latin American studies to create our own study abroad program, Spanish language and indigenous sustainability in Mérida, Yucatan, which is very much in connection with two of the main missions of our university, which is the mission to support sustainable development projects and the projects are related to diversity, connecting our research and our study abroad with indigenous epistemologies in Yucatan. So the combination of the interest of Agnese and Miguel and the combination of the interest of our university and some of the research that we're doing here at Villanova University fit perfectly with the topic that brings us together here to discuss. I also want to say thank you to many people who have been helping us to organize this conference. I want to start with Dr. Mercedes Julia from the Department of Spanish. She's our chair, so we want to thank you for your support on this conference. I also want to say thank you to Catherine Jetek-Soltis from Peace and Justice, Dr. Chiji Akoma from the Department of Global and Interdisciplinary Studies, Dr. Frank Galgano and Nate Weston, both from the Department of Geography and the Environment, Liesel Schwartz, who has been also super enthusiastic about these initiatives from the Office of Sustainability, the Lepage Center, Andreina Soto Segura, our colleague Cristina Soriano from the Department of History, and our colleague Tania Romero from the Department of Communications. They are all being very much involved in the organization of this conference and will be in some of the panels later in the day. However, the most important people that I want to acknowledge their role and their presence here, because they have been extremely helpful to organize this, are the following members of our staff at Villanova University. Chelsea Gerard, who is in the communications department for the college. Luz Griffin, who is the person who has been organizing all the events here at the Connolly for several years and who's retiring this year. Anne-Marie Joyce, our beloved Secretary Administrative Assistant at the Department of Romance Languages. Melanie Mankiewicz, who's tour de force, helping, organizing, and creating everything that you ask for in terms of helping to develop all the programs in our Department of Global Interdisciplinary Studies. Rebecca Rabalski and Jennifer Shu, who help us to create our flyers and help us to create our press release. And obviously the people that have been working with us with the hybrid panel that we're going to have later today, Elisa Wiley and Alvin Wong and Jill Gonzalez. So thank you very much to all of you. So now I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Agnès Codebo, who's going to be giving a brief presentation and reading the bio of our keynote speaker today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome again. And so I'm going to introduce our speaker today, our keynote speaker. Professor Gabriela Valdivia is a professor of geography at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and assistant dean in honors, Carolina. She's a feminist political ecologist examining the relationship between resources and socio-environmental inequities with a focus on environmental injustices in Latin America. Gabriela is the author of the digital project, Crude Entanglement, which explores the effective dimensions of oil production. She's also co-author of Oil Revolution and Indigenous Citizenship in Ecuadorian Amazonia and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Critical Resource Geography. Her talk today is titled Feminist Political Ecologies of Healing in the Americas, and please join me in welcoming Gabriela with us today.
Can I get it all settled first? And I'm kind of short, so I'm going to bring this down. Okay. All right. Is that clear enough? Great. Thank you so much for this invitation to be part of this conference, to be able to have the opportunity to talk about work that I love and places that I love and that have become part of my identity as a woman, as a professor, and as an advocate for environmental justice. My talk covers some reflection on what I have done over the last 20 years in Ecuador in terms of trying to understand how the oil complex works there, and some of the pivots that I have taken, both as a result of this extensive line of work, but also because of what COVID has done to my ability to enter spaces in Ecuador that I no longer can enter because of instability and because of increased danger for the people who work with me, and for my person as well. So I hope this situation changes, and so my talk kind of reflects this transition, trying to think myself and rethink and remember myself as a scholar. So let me start with perhaps one of the most famous and infamous texts about the history of Latin America. Eduardo Galeano's Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina is likely the most powerful story about the wounds caused by capitalism in the Americas. In the introductory chapter, Galeano writes, Latin America is the region of open veins. Everything was transmuted to distant regions, accumulated elsewhere. The soil, minerals, people, all kinds of resources. Latin America's backwardness and poverty are the result of colonial and neo-colonial alchemy, where gold changes into scrap metal and food into poison. Galeano was an environmental justice scholar. These are important words and images that trace the global political economy of capitalist proliferated inequities and the historical conditions of existence and re-existence in the Americas. As Claudia de Lima Costa and Sonia Alvarez remind us, however, powerful stories have representational economies. They cross geopolitical borders, importing and exporting ideas across regions and languages, and they might end up standing in for a complexity of experiences and knowledge systems they never claimed to represent in the first place. Such stories risk colonizing our habits of thought and our ability to see what else there is. I am interested in also telling parallel and intersecting stories with open veins, something different to help us color the histories that we teach and research about Latin America. And I see this line of work, these damage-centered stories, in the work that I have done in Ecuador, where I have been studying systems of domination and oil production for over the last 20 years. I've studied oil fields and refineries. I've studied oil-afflicted communities and state oil institutions, using an environmental justice lens that emphasizes harms committed by what Murat Arcel calls the extractive imperative. My scholarship in EJ has served to chart how the logics and logistics of domination perpetuate inequalities and indigenous elimination. So I'm going to give you a brief tour of some of this work on the logistics and logics of oil domination in Ecuador. And I have a number of set of themes that I've covered over time. I've talked about economic dependence and the creation of extractive sacrifice zones in Ecuador. Also, a lot of my work has focused on the shifting contract between the state and citizenship in Ecuador based on the ability to fund oil rents, fund social programming through oil rents. I have written about social uprisings, resistance, and the use of legal courts, both in the domestic sphere as well as the international sphere, to establish self-affirmation for Amazonian communities. And also, I have studied the everyday experience of life with oil, particularly in the Amazon and in the city of Esmeraldas, which is where the main refinery is located. So this is a bit of a tour of that work. First of all, we have to understand that oil mediates Ecuador's relationship with domestic economies and international economies. Ecuador is what you would refer to in the literature as a petrostate. Over 30% of Ecuador's export income comes from the trade of oil, crude oil. And as you can see in this tree map, the rest of the income, the export income that Ecuador relies on comes from other forms of extractive industries, whether it's agro-industry or whether it is the extraction of metals and extraction of sea resources. There's still quite a bit of oil left in Ecuador, even though the industry has been there for over 50 years. There's still quite a bit of oil left, particularly in proven reserves in the southern central Amazon of Ecuador, which now has been targeted for a new round of oil bids, of which new concessions have been allocated. And to maintain this economy, a lot of infrastructure is necessary. And often when we think about oil production, we think about oil fields. But I wanted to show you these maps as a reminder that there's a tremendous infrastructure that crisscrosses the country in order to be able to make oil, trade oil possible for Ecuador. And I call these infrastructures of the oil complex. They start, if I can create a story about this, we can think about the Amazon area, which is will be on the very right side of these two maps. You will find concession blocks, essentially that grid that is on the pink area right here on the right-hand side of the maps. Those are what you would call concession blocks. And essentially, they are a way of land rent where the Ecuadorian state leases the right to explore and extract resources from these spaces to private entities through a round of bids for the right to access that space. It kind of operates under the logic that there's nothing really in that space aside from the possibility and the promise of oil. But if you look at that, the pink area is actually the home to many Amazonian communities, both indigenous and settler communities in that space. And so there's an overlay of different interests and livelihoods that are present in those spaces beyond being just concession spaces. I also wanted to point out in the middle, you see the red dot, the red circles with numbers. That's a new kind of extractive economy that is taking off in Ecuador, and that is mining, metal mining. And in the south part of Ecuador, that will be gold. This is important because as the price of oil fluctuates, and this directly affects the economy, the income that the state has, then other extractive activities, such as mining, are taking off, and particularly gold, because gold often, the international price of gold goes up usually when you have a lower in oil price. So there's a need to balance that international and domestic economies. With this map here and I'm a geographer, so you're going to see lots of maps here. On this map on the left, you have sort of like the different phases of oil delivery and oil distribution in Ecuador. We have the oil fields and the oil extraction, the ponies on the right-hand side, which is where the Amazon is located. But then when that oil is pumped out, it needs to be transported across the Andes. So if you think about the Amazon as a lower lowlands kind of space, the crude oil is pumped through the pipelines to cross the Andes, so there's a significant change in elevation and pressure and temperature. And then downhill from the Andes, again, a significant change in the ambient temperature and the pressure. And then it's processed, taken to the main refinery in Esmeraldas. There are other smaller refineries, but the Esmeraldas one is the principal one because that's where oil is typically exported from. And so at each step, there are pumping stations on the Amazon side of the Andes, and then there are resistance stations on the coastal side of the Andes to make sure that the flow of oil is kept at a manageable pace. If these stations didn't work, then you have a lot of spillage, a lot of leakage, which you still do, but it'll be much more significant than it currently is. And I've also studied for a long time the social contract between the state and citizens. And a lot of my work has focused on understanding what role oil plays in that. And since the establishment of the oil industry in the 1970s in Ecuador, we have a constant presence of oil-related funds, oil rents, in social spending. There's a way in which oil became the fuel of urban development in Ecuador, focusing on urbanization, focusing on social spending and social programming, focusing on subsidies for energy, transportation, gas, and also an emphasis on social upward mobility that really took off after Ecuador nationalized its oil industry and created its own state oil company. So this is somewhere between the 70s and the mid-80s. And somewhere around the mid-80s, you have a contraction and you have changes and dramatic changes in the price of oil in the international market, and that led to a contraction in the income that Ecuador was receiving from its oil exports, and also a restructuring of the way in which the state handled its income. So this is what we refer to as a long neoliberal night in Ecuador, because it was a piecemeal neoliberal restructuring of the management and the ownership of oil-related infrastructures and operations. This changed at the shift of the 21st century. There's great discontent in the way in which the state provides to its citizenry, and you have social movements and social parties that tend to have more of a left-wing oriented politics to them, and you have the emergence of a political party with Rafael Correa. It's called the Citizens' Revolution, and as its name suggests, it is meant to signify the idea that citizens are revolting or uprising against the way in which the state is managed. And this took off during the presidency of Rafael Correa between 2007 and 2016. And I marked this period because I'm going to show you a graph later on that matches very well with what happened during this time. The citizen revolution is kind of like a return to the oil development and upward mobility stage at the beginning of the oil industry in Ecuador. There's significant urbanization, particularly in strategic areas, and a proliferation of different kinds of cash payment programs, which were kind of like a renaming of the old World Bank bonuses that were attributed to it during the 1980s. This kind of ended after the presidency of Rafael Correa, and then you have a surgence of a different kind of political structure and logic following the election of Guillermo Lasso, which was in 2021, with the creation of a new party called Creating Opportunities. Again, this is a name that sort of signifies social ethos going on in Ecuador, which is signifying the break between a time of lack of opportunities to a reinvestment in the entrepreneurial citizen with Guillermo Lasso, who was an independent candidate and who had been a former banker for the Ecuadorian state back in the late 1990s. But I just wanted to show you a little bit what this feels like, because I can tell you stories, but there's something about audio and visual that can be very compelling. So I'm going to see if I can do this here, maybe. So this is a very short clip that was created during the Citizens' Revolution period to create this, to remind citizens that the Ecuadorian state is doing its job in terms of investing in in society. Am I clicking on the right place? Okay. Oh, no, I'm not.
Para el pueblo, lo que es del pueblo, porque el pueblo se lo ganó. Para el pueblo, lo que es el pueblo, para el pueblo.
El desarrollo de la comunidad es prioridad. La empresa pública Ecuador Estratégico invierte los recursos económicos provenientes de los sectores estratégicos en saneamiento ambiental, escuelas, hospitales, centros de salud, carreteras, parques y más obras de desarrollo integral para las comunidades cercanas a los megaproyectos. Ecuador crece.
Avanzar.
Great. So part of what was really amazing about that period of the Revolución Ciudadana was the social media campaigns and how powerful they were. There were hundreds of these very short 1-minute jingles throughout the media, throughout Twitter, throughout social media accounts. The Ecuadorian government created its own TV programs, its own newspapers, and its own social media channels to continue this campaign of recovering and sort of redefining the relationship between state and citizenship, which was incredibly effective. And I wanted to show you also this map of investment, of oil investment in upward mobility and urbanization in Ecuador, with a focus on the areas that were considered to be strategic areas, and which are really strategic areas because they are sacrifice zones where the presence of the oil industry really changes the environments and the bodies that intersect with it. So primarily in the Amazon region, there's an investment in hospitals, an investment in urban centers, an investment investment in the roads and sidewalks. There are small communities, indigenous communities that are turned into small urban areas. They might be 8 blocks big, but nonetheless there'll be sidewalks and stop signs and that sort of thing, which was a really fascinating way of envisioning what it means to have a relationship with the state and social spending. The emphasis throughout this entire period of the Revolución Ciudadana, which is what I've really focused on in my work, has been on this alchemy of oil into the urban experience of social mobility. And I'm really glad that this is an audience that can understand Spanish and read Spanish, because when I give these, I have to do a lot of translation work. But I just wanted to point out that during this period of the Revolución Ciudadana, at the turn of the very first decade and middle of the second decade of the Revolución Ciudadana in the 2000s, you have an increase in social spending in all areas and across all different kinds of populations. So you have bonuses and cash payments distributed to households led by single mothers. You have an increase in bonuses for people with different abilities. You have an increase in bonuses for Social Security, as well as for agricultural investment and housing investment. So there's a way in which these oil funds get transmitted throughout these small programs that are affected a very diverse group of people. And so for somebody like me who studies environmental justice and focuses on the inequities and the extraction that I emphasized with Galeano's narrative at the beginning, it reminds me how complex it is to have an oil complex and an economy run on oil that does this kind of thing, the distribution of those rents, but at the same time reproduces inequities elsewhere. And I wanted to point out a little bit about how this works, because we often put the international market at the back of these stories of environmental justice and inequities. And I wanted to point out how the price of oil really shapes the way in which Ecuador is able or not able to distribute oil income. So in the decades starting from the 2000s, you can see that the price of oil has varied dramatically. Anywhere that it is over $100 a barrel of oil is a bonus for economies like Ecuador's, for any petrostate. But whenever it falls beneath the price of production, and in Ecuador the price of production for an oil barrel is somewhere between $20 and $45, depending on how old that well is and how mature the fields are, then if it falls below the cost of production, then you have a loss for the country. And when we say that a barrel of oil is a certain amount, Ecuador doesn't get the entire amount, but that amount is distributed between the oil operators, which tend to be independent or international operators, and fees and taxes and so on, and maintenance fees also that get added to that. So there's a distribution of that barrel of oil that is not just all going to the state. And I wanted to show you something here, just focusing on this very last period, towards the end of the Revolución Ciudadana. You have a drastic drop in the price of oil. And you have, again, a push for a more conservative approach to oil spending in social programming. And so that has driven a lot of the ways in which the Ecuadorian state over the last 7 years has been reducing its social spending, has been reducing subsidies to fuel, to transportation, and some of that has translated into uprisings that were really have been really significant, particularly in 2019. There was a huge uprising related to the drop of subsidies in transportation and fuel in October of 2019. And I also wanted to point out at the very end, when we think about there's a drop in the price of oil with COVID and with these uprisings in 2020 is a critical moment. And then by 2022, we have a rise in the value of the barrel of oil due to the invasion of Russia. And the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so this is leading to, I'm really interested in trying to follow up what this rise in the price of the barrel of oil is going to do for Ecuador's petrostate policies. Okay, and I wanted to give you a tour a bit of the imagery of the landscapes where the oil complex is located. This is in the Amazon area, so this would be like phase 1. And this is obviously a storage site. You can see the storage buildings, infrastructure there, the roads, the encampment areas. But typically when you have an oil well that is established, there's hardly anything there. All the infrastructure is either the pipelines that are extracted directly from the well, and they tend to look like, when you look at aerial photography, these tend to look like large grass fields. After the oil well has been put in place. And this is in terms of the transportation element. When we're thinking about the Amazon, we have to remember that it's a hyper-humid environment with a lot of leaching, a lot of rainfall, a lot of shifting temperatures between diurnal and nocturnal times. And largely, you have a lot of clay soils in this area, so there's a lot of settling soil happening. So the infrastructures that are holding the pipelines are always shifting because you have the clay that is expanding and contracting with the shifting humidity and the shifting presence of water in the soil, right? Clay tends to do that. And you also have a lot of leaching that happens due to the weathering of the metals themselves. And so spills are actually a daily occurrence. Some of them are bigger and thus appear in the media more often, but spills are happening all the time. This is a space of leaching and the decomposition at its prime. And so when you have leaching, whether it is chronic and slow or fast and eventful, it moves into the space where you have vegetation, it's absorbed by the vegetation, it's absorbed by the soils, and this leads to a process of bioaccumulation of toxicity in different species in the Amazon. So if it covers fish, if it covers insects, or if it covers plants, it will be consumed by another level of species, and so you will find it later on in birds and mammals, and later on in the meat that Amazonian communities hunt in those spaces, and then you find it in the bodies of people. So as a response from Amazonian communities to these kinds of ecological devastations that are associated with the oil complex, there have been a series of really high profile and watershed moments in reconstituting and redefining what resistance might look like in relation to oil. So I'm gonna focus on one in particular that is one, like the very first one that really appeared as an international event. And that is what is often referred to as the trial of the century in the Amazon. In 1993, about 30,000 plaintiffs, both Amazonian indigenous peoples and Amazonian settlers in the northern Ecuadorian Amazon, filed a class action lawsuit against Texaco's national operator in Ecuador. Between 1964 and 1990, Texaco had allegedly spilled over 16 million gallons of crude oil, which is significant, and it is an incredible amount of destruction that happened in relation to it. Studies have shown that there's a high incidence of cancer clusters, miscarriages, skin conditions, and birth defects associated with this event. In 1997, there was an agreement between the Ecuadorian government and Texaco to do a cleanup, but the cleanup was considered to be defective and inefficient. The lawsuit continued. In 2001, Texaco was bought by Chevron, so it merged with Chevron. And there was a ruling that was reached in 2014 that found Chevron at fault, Texaco Chevron at fault, and then Chevron appealed for a more favorable income. The fascinating thing about this 20-year-old lawsuit, almost 20-year-old lawsuit, is that it has been moving across different courts. So it went to the New York Court of Appeals, then it came back to Ecuador, then it moved to Canada, then it moved to The Hague. And part of this was a strategy by Chevron to try to find the right court that will fail in favor of the company. What they did find out, and what has been developing over the last 10 years, is that a lot of these lawsuits are now being set in international arbitration courts, which are very closed courts. They are not open to media. They're not open to the public. You don't have a jury. You just have like a set of lawyers and representatives for each of the parties who will decide who is at fault in the lawsuit. International arbitration lawsuits tend to favor private and international organizations, and they tend to find states at fault over 50% of the time. So this was a move by Chevron to try to not meet the the ruling that was reached in 2014, and they succeeded in 2019 in The Hague, where the International Arbitration Court deemed Ecuador at fault. Okay. Nonetheless, because of the extensiveness, because of the magnitude of this lawsuit, this became a reminder of how important the court system can be for claims of Amazonian peoples. And so I want to mention two of these lawsuits that have built on the experience of the Texaco lawsuit and have had more favorable outcomes than the Texaco lawsuit. I'm going to focus on the Cofán case, and I'm going to focus on the Waorani case. Both of them use some of the same spaces of legal appeal that are in the international court. One of them is the ILO Convention of 1969 that requires that there needs to be an agreement on consent by the peoples who are living in the spaces that are going to be affected by extractive activities. But Ecuador, at the same time as the Texaco lawsuit was going on, and at the same time that it was trying to follow the ILO Convention of 169, it also decreed that there were situations, strategic advantage situations for the nation that could bypass this need for consent, and that it only required to have participation from indigenous communities in the communication of this information. And I put participation in quotes because this became the really critical issue for Amazonian peoples. In the case of the Cofán had been involved in the Texaco case, and they learned a lot about the social media campaigns, the role of the public awareness, the role of having courts and juries in articulating their rights to land in a free and clean environment. And so when oil mining activities moved into the space of the Cofán and the foothills of the Andes, you have a memory of these legal moments, and sort of they also sought to sue the government for the concessions that were being placed in that area that had not gone through a consultation process. The consultation process really is something that Ecuador had been developing through its community social programming and with international companies. But the local courts in the northern Amazon decided that the consultation process had not been followed, that the Cofán had not given consent to their presence, and the ruling cites the precautionary principles of 1992 and the use of Ecuador's the law on the rights of nature to be able to sustain the claim that actual damage had been caused to the land and that it needed to be repaired. Again, this all builds on that very first trial that happened with Texaco. And this all is happening during that drop in the price of oil, and where the new president and the new government are trying to figure out, well, where are we going to sustain this 30% of export of incomes that is really, funneling all the money into social spending and programming. So there's sort of like this moment where you have resistance and you have the ability to be able to the right to live in a clean environment, and you have an economy that has been very dependent on deriving oil rents and resource extraction rents from those very same spaces. The second case that I wanted to mention is that of the Waorani, which is the most recent one as well, and that is they filed a lawsuit against the Ecuadorian government for serious structural flaws in their consultation process in one of the rounds for oil concessions and in communicating information about oil extraction in 2012. This perhaps is another one of those watershed moments in indigenous rights and defense of land, because it pinpointed the places where the law had been carried out, but the practice itself, the consultation practice, had been at fault, was structurally faulty. In the sense that, for example, the Waorani were given pages and pages of information, very technical, jargony language that they could not really process in the time that they were given to decide whether they were going to consent or not. Meanwhile, so at the same time, there are these other constituencies from oil companies who are trying to separate different Waorani leaders and trying to promise them that things will be good, or they were promising them individual gains. knowing that the Waorani are more of a collective, collaborative decision-making body. There's also there's significant literature that tracks the ways in which the Waorani act as a collective, and a lot of this information was used in the bidding, in the consultation process to try to actually divide and conquer the Waorani. And so this became part of the lawsuit, that there was kind of intentional, ill-intentioned actions, conscious or unconscious, that had led to a faulty consultation process. And they won the lawsuit, which was actually amazing. But they didn't do it on their own. Indeed, legal courts and legal work had been crucial in understanding this, and legal work that has been coming from the spaces of the Amazon, particularly through organizations such as Amazon Frontlines. And so both lawsuits, both the COFAN lawsuit and the Waorani lawsuit, have been in consultation and with support and resources of Amazon Frontlines. So if you ever feel that you want to support the legal efforts of that area, I would recommend looking at the Amazon Frontlines, looking up Digital Democracy, and looking up the COFAN Survival Organization. Okay, but like I said, the bidding continues because Ecuador's political economic structure is set up to be an extractive one. And it's set up to focus on these high-paying resources such as gold and oil. And so one of the last bidding concessions, and this happened in February of this year, was won by the Chinese National Petroleum Company, which has a very different relationship with Ecuador than the other companies, and also because the usual suspects of oil bids have been very reticent to investing in Ecuador, precisely because of the lawsuits that have been falling in favor of communities, and that is considered to be a high-risk environment for investment. So the story continues. Okay. I want to highlight one last space, and I'm going to transition to where I'm sort of re-envisioning my scholarship in relation to oil in Ecuador. The last space that I want to talk about is that of the processing of oil, the refinery of Esmeraldas, which is on the coast, the northern coast, on the border with Colombia. And this is historically an Afro-Ecuadorian space. It has been so for centuries, throughout the colonial period as well. And here is where a lot of our research suggests that this complexity of oil injustices and social spending and programming kind of coalesce and are sort of made from this, they're entangled in the social fabric. Okay. So this is based on a study that my collaborator Flora Liu and I conducted between 2011 and 2017. And throughout that period, we collected information and gathered data, trying to understand and create evidence that helped us understand how people related to the presence of the oil refinery and the oil fields in Ecuador. We conducted a study that used a strategic sampling and a stratified sampling throughout the city of Esmeraldas, which is located right next to the refinery. I don't know if I have a marker here. I don't know. So this structure, there's a structure on the very right, on the very left-hand side, then that is the refinery campus. And then the city of Esmeraldas is this entire area with the circles, and those are the areas that we sampled. And in terms of environmental justice evidence, in terms of evidence of ill-doing, we wanted to know how people perceive the refinery through their bodies and their environments. And one of the things we find out, which is very typical of an environmental justice site, a site of exposure, is that you have a higher incidence of chronic inflammatory diseases in areas that are in proximity of refineries. You can see that in the areas in the south, which are the ones that are closest to, in terms of distance from the refinery, you have a higher incidence of arthritis, cancer, dermatitis, diabetes, and herpes. But for the most part, these are inflammatory diseases. That is, these are diseases that the body has a response to, and it becomes chronic because there's a constant exposure to toxins and other elements that are entering the body, and the body is being activated by it. And it manifests in joints, it manifests in the respiratory system, it manifests in the gastrointestinal system. It manifests through headaches, which is one of the things that most people complained about as one of their everyday experiences living in the city. Arthritis in particular is something that many respondents mentioned as present not only in their own bodies, but in the bodies of those that were in their immediate families. And arthritis is an inflammatory response. Now, I'm going to bring that graph that I had up there, and I'm going to add it to some of the things other information that we collected in that space. We worked with Esmeraldeños. They were our ethnographers, our ears and our eyes on the ground, because the city of Esmeraldas is quite large and diverse and expanded. So we worked with 8 different ethnographers, and they collected information. They took pictures of things that they thought was important. It was kind of like a photo voice ethnographic project. And some of the quotes, some of the things that they said as they experienced the space, and as Esmeraldeños who were studying other Esmeraldeños' responses in terms of the refinery. So in terms of toxicity, most of the toxicity is happening in the southern part of the city, which makes sense because that's where the refinery is located. And also most of the social investment and social compensation is happening in those areas. But as this quote that I pulled out here from one of our ethnographers suggests, it's a bit of a contradiction, and it is social compensation does not alleviate the harm that is created by exposure. It creates band-aids, it creates distractions, it creates the ability to meet other oppressions, but in a way which is sacrificial because you're creating oppressions on the body, you're creating oppressions on future generations at the same time. Okay, and this perhaps is the most telling slide for me to try to rethink how I think with the oil complex in Ecuador. One of the things we wanted to know from Esmeraldeños is, well, not just only how they perceive, but what does that perception of living with a refinery next door, what is it like? What is it about? And so we asked people, we didn't ask them if the refinery harms you, but we asked them, well, what does the refinery do in your space? How do you notice its presence? And the overwhelming amount of responses that we received are that the refinery does things to support us. The refinery creates schools and invests in health brigades and gives donations to communities for birthdays or for celebrations. They clean up green areas. They support housing through the purchasing of housing construction elements or even lending their machines to pave and put asphalt on the streets. At the same time, we also asked them about their environments and their bodies. How do their environments feel and how their bodies feel? And as you can see in these slides, residents are attuned to the environment. They notice the foul air, and if you've ever driven by a refinery or walked by a refinery, you'll know what I'm talking about. It smells like sulfur, like rotten eggs. If it's windy, you might not notice it that much, but if the winds die down and you're in the right place, your eyes, your nose, your throat will start telling you that there's something that is going on in that space. And that is very frequent in Esmeraldas. Also, river contamination. Refineries use river water or fresh water to cool down their turbines, to cool down their processing units, and then that water gets sent back to the river. And so its temperature changes, its chemistry changes, and anything that is river down from a refinery will have a very different ecology to it than it does when it's upstream from a refinery. And at the same time, there's a large perception of chronic illnesses, the ones that I had mentioned early on. But perhaps one of the most disorienting findings that we had is that when we did in-depth interviews and focus groups, one of the main points that would come out is that taking this all information into account, that the refinery is a good neighbor. And that was not the kind of evidence that we wanted to find. That's not the kind of thing that we could get behind and advocate. because it neutralized some of our ideas about what injustices are. It made us look back into those ideas and try to understand what story is it that I'm bringing into this space about injustice, and what is it that we are not seeing when we enter that space and when we live that space from there. And certainly there are movements that are very attuned to these environmental injustices, but it also reminded us that environmental justice, as we consider in terms of body burdens, is a limited and very narrow understanding of social justice in that space. And so this is where I kind of want to think about not only the logic of oil production and the logistics of oil production and how that determines our understanding of the degraded lives and environments, but also to understand and try to find spaces for healing. The wounds are complex and intersectional. And we wanted to know, where is the room for healing? Reproducing stories about open wounds alone does not uproot colonial or colonizing habits and practices. That is, damage-centered narratives can move publics, can make us donate, can make us invest, but they risk reifying partial representations that disavow voice and agency and gloss over the complexity of self-determination and self-affirmation. Equally dangerous is the idea that both oppressors and oppressed resist as homogeneous, singular in their motivations, desires, and experiences. So again, where is the room for healing, and for whose healing? So this is where I pivot in my presentation. I want to make room for what decolonial and queer feminists in the Americas call a pluralist approach to stories of liberation, self, and society that hold multiple desires and experiences in the movement towards self-affirmation. Like Venas Abiertas, these stories also live intersectionally with capitalist relations and desire different socialities. Looking for such companion stories is not a hopeful denial of the atrocities lived in capitalist societies, which is I've just spent the last 20 minutes talking about, but rather I see them as an ethical move to hold space for concurrent projects for healing. This standpoint and orientation is what I refer to as feminist political ecologies of healing. It is the attention to how individuals reconstitute elements of their sociality, dispersed or broken apart by capitalist, racist, and patriarchal fragmentation, into a different kind of formation, which allows them to enact self-affirming shifts in their political, economic, and ecological realities. So a feminist political ecology approach to healing does not follow a theory of change that starts and ends with documenting harm and injustice. And I kind of think that my previous work, though it has been deep in different areas, it has sort of been within that space of documenting harm and injustice. And instead, what I want to do is to involve tracing healing through what Chela Sandoval calls moves or movidas within a map of relationality. And here I'm using the work of Mildred Beltre, who is an artist based in New York, to think through what these maps of relationality might look like. It starts from attention to differential consciousness, a breaking through whatever controls access to rights, resources, and justice. This break can be a temporary puncture in everyday dominant discourses that allow a person to move differently in their relations. Geographer Risha Nagar calls these moves agitations that muddy the waters. So next, I want to expand on these moves. Border thinking and decolonial feminist scholars in the Americas theorize that moves of differential consciousness require enfleshed practice. That is, it's not a question of how to think differently, but of noticing where we think from, with what discourses and what frames, and what constrains our ability to notice what else there is. The work of Maria Lugones, especially her work on pilgrimajes and peregrinajes, offers a helpful framing, and I want to highlight 3 observations here. The first one is that differential consciousness is a practice of self-awareness. In a narrow understanding of difference, we tend to place ourselves within a singular category or singular categories, indigenous, woman, mestizo, white, settler, as if the category were us. Lugones calls this categorical thinking, a practice that fractures or fragments the self into simplified categories of difference, according to race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and so on, that on one hand make life more accessible to governance according to norms and normalcy, and two, make liveliness functional to the dominant society and the reproduction of power structures. For Lugones, this categorical thinking asphyxiates the individual. And in EJ language, categorical thinking is dehumanizing. The alienation of the self from its multiple socialities is expressed in dispossession, environmental degradation, body burdens, and so on, all of which communicate that some relations and desires and longings are extractable, disposable, and sacrificial. Categorical thinking also echoes what Maya Xinca communitarian feminist and sanadora Lorena Cabnal denounces as the violence that fragments land-body-territory relations. For Lugones, differential consciousness is the start for breaking from categorical thinking. It is noticing ourselves as multiple and our subjectivities through various prisms. A consciousness of self in the plural needs to be in the very structure of theories of healing. The second point that I want to make is that a border thinking theory of healing needs a playful attitude. This is about foregrounding wonder, speculation, and imagination in the ways in which we frame injustice and resistance to injustice. Again, Lugones is instructive here. She asks us to notice the spaces in between categories, what she calls liminal spaces. She invites us to play with the in-between rather than hold on to sacred norms in order to know each other's worlds, and to travel or trespass categorical thinking with wonder to notice how others construct their visions and their liveliness. And I think one of the, like a beautiful example of this is what Andrea Ballesteros does with her book on the future history of water, where she thinks through the categorical thinking that shapes our understanding of water as a right or water as a commodity. Healing is an openness to self-construction that needs a lovingly playful attitude. And I think this is where Gloria Anzaldua's storytelling is helpful too. I'm thinking especially about her reflections on Coyolxauhqui's imperative. In the Florentine Codex, Coyolxauhqui, la diosa de la luna, is represented as a warrior goddess dismembered by her half-brother, the god of war, after she killed her mother, Coatlicue. And so this is a stone of Coyolxauhqui, and you can see her dismembered body in terms of the fragmentation of her bones, her dismembered head. The Europeanized rendering is often retold to evoke the founding of new social orders birthed through strength and conquest by new dominant societies, and to forget what was resisted in the process. Yet little is said about Coyolxauhqui's desire. For Gaspar de Alba, for example, the goddess was framed as a bad daughter. And for Luna and Galeana, Coyolxauhqui is a partera, is a birthing text of cycles, transitions, and transformation across difference. For Anzaldúa, the goddess's desire is clear. Her imperative is to remember herself after violent fragmentation by calling back dispersed pieces of conocimiento. In Anzaldúa's reframing, Coyolxauhqui's dismembered body is imbued with intention, with desire, and with vitality and movement. Her healing story is about rebirth in various iterations of self-awareness and in reassembling her humanity through a shift in realities which can be conflictive, adaptive, diplomatic, and ambiguous. And so these are some of what Anzaldúa calls the garabatos that she used in her presentations, and I find them incredibly generative for thinking through what healing might look like. The third and last point that I want to make in terms of decolonial and border thinking is that healing is at the intersection of resistance and oppression and being oppressed. For Lugones, liberatory struggle, grounded in narrow circles of resistance and recognition, colludes with the logic of fragmentation. The theory of healing that she proposes is to develop a double vision that recognizes resistance to particular forms of oppression at particular times in particular spaces. Such noticing is more than a meeting of interests or common interests. It is a shift in consciousness to note the multiplicities of oppressing and being oppressed and resisting. It requires recognition of the intersectionality of oppressions, which can be big and small, as real to the struggle, not external to it. So next, I want to place this thinking, this border thinking, to theorize healing from the Amazon, going back to the Cofán and to the Waorani. I'm going to start with the Waorani. So I want to tell this story through an experience of research that Flora Lu and I had. Remember that project I had talked about between 2011 and 2017? An experience that we had with two Waorani leaders, Alicia Cahuilla and Manuela Omari Ima. They're both really well-known Waorani leaders. They're not the younger ones, they're newer, younger Waorani leaders now, but these are some of the historical leaders of Waorani women. One of the things that we have to note, and I've been trying to push with this theorizing with border thinking, is that we cannot homogenize uprisings, we cannot homogenize the identities of indigenous peoples, even though they might all be belonging to a particular group such as the Waorani. In my conversations with Alicia and Manuela, I could understand that they were very different kinds of leaders and that they made incredible efforts to be intentionally different from each other. Alicia is the kind of leader who focuses on demanding rights and demanding protection from the Ecuadorian state. She has denounced the oil patriarchy. She has denounced the ways in which machismo and extractivism match each other and coincide in the spaces of the Waorani, much more alike the work of Lorena Cabnal. But in the case of Alicia, she demands protection. She says if Ecuador is going to be extracting from our territories, Ecuador needs to give back to the Waorani in very concrete ways. She wants to see people protected, she wants to see health protected, and she demands to be noticed as a political leader. Manuela, on the other side, tends to focus on the Waorani as valuable people, as in their humanity. So she highlights the stories of resistance of the Waorani through their arts, through their culture, through their language. She's a big believer of the idea of weaving social skin and weaving social connections through networks, through alliances. And a lot of the political rhetoric that she uses is like that. It's about connection. It's about growing the social skin of the Waorani beyond their immediate communities. And so the different styles of leadership are also different ways of being Waorani that are not homogenizing, but are very particular to their experiences growing up as Waorani women in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And so we invited them to come to North Carolina for the FemGL conference in 2017 as part of this effort of weaving social skin together, of connections, of establishing connections, of playfully traveling across worlds to create something of a bigger sphere of contention for the Waorani. Flora Lu and I had gone to their spaces and had tried to see their worlds and be part of the worlds, and this was an invitation for two Waorani women to come to North Carolina to be part of our worlds and to engage with us in that space. And we wrote up this work, by the way, in a chapter on unbounding feminist geography. And so we traveled with them, and there was a lot of fun and playfulness. There was a lot of connection and disconnection and misunderstandings. There was a lot of equivocation in our travels, but that was part of what kept us together. I would say that this is the kind of playful world traveling that Lugones was alluding to, and we were trying to perform it in our own particular way, in our own particular times and spaces. The Waorani see non-Waorani people as Kowori, and Kowori really means non-human in Waorani language. And this was a really interesting moment for their presentations as well, to be considered non-human in the space of the Waorani while we were in North Carolina. And we mapped each other as well. We tried to draw our presence, we tried to draw our spaces in the presence of each other to try to communicate our stories. And we were also filmed. They filmed us filming them in ways that were really disorienting to try to figure out who the subject and object were in our study of research. We were trying to produce knowledge together in ways that were uncomfortable, but also liberatory, because it allowed us to see, well, ask the question, what else is there beyond this researcher relationship? Oops. Okay, so a few lessons from that encounter and thinking through this border theory with our Waorani collaborators. The first one is that weaving is a work of and for translation. Our relationship had to be constantly and intentionally kept as a translational story where we committed treason against each other and we tried to connect with each other imperfectly. The social skin that we wove together wasn't perfect. It felt kind of like bunched up in certain moments. It felt like we were not getting anywhere in our conversations, but sometimes there were moments of connection that were quite beautiful and transformative for them and for me. Weaving social skins requires lovingly playful equivocation. We might think we are in the same conversation, and we might believe that we're sharing the same goals, and yet the words might be the same, but the meanings are shifting, not only prior to our engagement, but also after our engagement. The second case that I want to highlight here is the case of the COFAN. And for this case study, I draw on the long-standing work on care and conservation in the Amazon by my close collaborators. These are Michael Esbach, who over the last 4 years has worked closely with the COFAN of Sábalo and Sinangoe. He's a bicultural conservation ecologist. Michael has participated in hunting and fishing expeditions, community meetings, mingas, and COFAN everyday life. And he has supported the data collection efforts of the COFAN to make themselves visible on maps for legal purposes, in particular for land titling, including GPS measurements in COFAN territory, such as boundaries, houses, streams, to support land titling demands. This work on conservation and care in the Amazon is also part of the work that Flora Lu, my long-term collaborator, has been doing in the Amazon with the Waorani and now with the COFAN. And Flora Lu is a co-author with me on the book on Amazonian citizenship. And both Michael and Flora have worked with Felipe Borman Kenama, a trilingual COFAN leader and Puifama Tesucho, which in COFAN means knower of both sides, who moves between Sábalo and urbanized spaces in his roles as hunter, fisher, former municipality president, graduate student, and collaborator with non-COFAN people. He's a world traveler. Okay, so this is part of a digital geohumanities effort carried out by the COFAN and by Amazon Frontlines. It is designed by Digital Democracy, which is an organization I've also worked with that does a lot of work with Amazonian peoples. The story is written by Alianza Seibo, which has Waorani members in it, and Amazon Frontlines, which is the non-governmental organization that I mentioned earlier, supporting the legal cases of Amazonian peoples. So if you search Amazon Frontlines, you will find this information there. Based on what Esbach, Borman, and Lu have learned from their collaboration with the COFAN, they argue for a more pluralistic approach to stewardship in the Amazon. And a lot of what they propose overlaps and reinforces the kind of border thinking coming from feminists in Latin America, from decolonial feminists in Latin America. For example, in Sábalo, they witnessed collective efforts to Sampima Koiraye, which means care for the forest. This was present in various dynamic COFAN institutions. It is an ethic of caretaking that is distinct and complementary to Western conservation. They also note the practice of Puifama Ateseyu, or two-world knowledge, which is akin to the colonial concepts. Puifama Ateseyu is a shift in consciousness responding to extractive colonialism. It is an epistemological framework to simultaneously hold and understand multiple ways of knowing and related practices aligned with desires to Sampima Koiraye, or forest caretaking. Puifama Ateseyu, that two-world knowledge, argue Esbach and Lu and Borman, is a desire-based practice to connect with Western conservationists from where the COFAN stand and from where they inhabit their world. But this is not homogeneous or singular. That is, for some COFAN, Sampina Koiraisendueku is a moral duty to safeguard future generations. Yet others practice it as a way to maintain a satisfactory lifestyle of conviviality and abundance, and they see their responsibilities within the community as pragmatic. It's more of a present relationship rather than a moral duty with the future. Regardless of diverse approaches to Puifama Teseyu, it seems that the COFAN are making differential consciousness moves to move beyond integration, combination, and incorporation of different ways of knowing. And Esbach et al. Also observed that a new cadre of leaders are trained to be Puifama Teseyu in the making. The COFAN are reassembling themselves. They are picking up pieces of conocimiento, and they're remembering themselves in ways that are different and in response to the kind of colonial fragmentation that they have experienced. In their desire to Sambima Koiraye, the COFAN modified their conceptualizations, practices, and negotiations with outsiders. They participate in outside initiatives, recognizing that while obligations for enacting care endure, ways of doing so are dynamic. They're engaged in playful categorical trespassing. Among these practices is the COFAN Guard program, a strategy to defend territory through regular patrolling, maintaining trails, and a permanent presence in guard stations at the boundaries of their territory. One of the members of this guard is Alexandre Narvaez, and rather than me telling you what the guard is about, I'd love to share this interview with her. It's a 2-minute interview.
Mi nombre es Alexandre Narvaez, soy de aquí de la comunidad AICOFAN de Sinagüe. Soy guardia de aquí, también soy coordinadora de mujeres de la asociación Chameco. La guardia somos un grupo de defensores de derechos humanos y de defensores de nuestros territorios. Fue un día de asamblea donde decidí formar parte de la guardia. Quise hacer ver a las mujeres que también somos capaces de levantarnos, de luchar, que nuestra voz sea escuchada. Mi motivo también fue dejar un futuro, un legado a mis hijas. En el 2017 descubrimos empresas mineras contaminando nuestro territorio. Están contaminando nuestro río Aguarico. El río Aguarico para nosotros los cofanes es fuente de vida, porque nuestras chacras están a la orilla del río Aguarico. Nuestros hijos se bañan en él. Nosotros como mamás, como mujeres, salimos a lavar la ropa, a traer agua para cocinar nuestra comida del día. Esa agua bebemos, tomamos. Estamos luchando contra las mineras, contra los madereros, contra los invasores que ingresan a la caza, a la pesca. Recorremos, vamos a ver si hay mineros ilegales, igual que entran a cazar, vemos si no hay huellas que han entrado. Y ahora estamos en el proceso de mapeo, queremos coger pruebas para decirle al Estado que nuestro territorio no está vacío, nuestro territorio tiene mucha vida para nosotros y demostrarles que es nuestro.
Okay. So the guard, this patrolling guard, is a system of adaptive management that resists extractive capitalism by connecting with, but not being assimilated by, Western conservation. And such is the case of Alexandre Narvaez, who has told us about this program. But adaptive management systems, as a way of responding and resisting oppression, has also opened up other spaces for resisting overlapping, smaller scale, larger scale, whichever way you want to represent them, but intersectional oppressions with that of extractivism. In interviews with Esbach, she describes what led her to the decision to participate in the COFAN Guard. In community assemblies, she noticed that women never participated. Women, she said, cannot talk. I always saw those things as women. They never made us participate. A few years ago, the opportunity came up for her. At a community assembly, leaders asked for volunteers to form a patrolling guard. Those who wanted to participate raised their hands, and Alexandra did too. The men and women present at the assembly questioned her. Why do you want to, being a woman? The guard is for men. They have to walk through the forest. They know how to walk. You are a woman. You don't know how to. You won't be able to. You're going to be a burden. The women said the same. You have to stay at home. Alexandra, maintained her position, and in the end, they agreed to respect her desire. I want to pause here to notice Alexa's self-awareness and her desire to reassemble her sociality. This is about the ways that all socialities are dynamic, moved by their members. The GUARD program, itself a push back against categorical thinking, opened up liminal spaces for Alexa to question and to express her desires. But then she faced difficult moments and critiques that affected her deeply. So why did she stay? She stayed because she no longer wanted to be she longed to be part of an initiative of defending Cofán land. She wanted to feel proud. Women know the forest too, she says. Women are connected through their sentir, through their body, their land, their territory relations. She says, as the first woman in the GUARD community program, this is historic. This has not been easy. I have a dream as a woman, the objective that this fight is not a man's fight. This is a woman's fight too. Nosotras, as mothers, we are very close to the territory. We are connected because we are the ones who plant, we are the ones who look for the medicine, we are the ones who look for water and make chucula, our chicha. She stays to respond to what she calls pensamiento machista. This is what's historic for her too. It was her first win against man's thought. That's what she calls it, man's thought. She stays to end that kind of thinking and so that women can feel able to act on those things, to feel able to walk, free to decide whether they want to participate or not, and so that they don't feel inferior. She stays because she longs to use her voice. And if you look up Alexandre Narvaez on the internet, you will see that this is a woman with a very powerful voice. She says, women have the power to shout, poder de gritar, the power to walk the places we know, the sacred sites, and to learn about new places and old places that our parents and grandparents taught us. And she stays because of the constant pushback she receives from both men and women, which is devastating for her as well. She's told that she's a bad mother and a bad woman, like Koyol Sauki. And she says this affected her deeply, but she stayed on. Herself is remembering, reconstituting in the process to a more self-affirming version of herself. Linking together these multiple oppressions and resistances, she says, for women, territory is life too. As women, through our dances, our songs, we fight for our territory. We communicate our culture. There are women and children in this territory. It is not empty, and it is not for sale, and it is not to be given away. Our land is our decision. Alexa offers an example of women who become protagonists of their own transformation through self-consciousness and enfleshed practice. This move was set in the experience of relearning how to be Cofán. So here I have some conclusions. Lugones uses the concepts of pilgrimaje and peregrinaje, a long and meandering transitive journey to the space between fragmentation and becoming multiple, to notice the edges of fragmentation and active subjectivity. As Mildred Beltre, who was a long-term collaborator with Lugones as well, she writes, this journey requires to cultivate a double or triple vision that sees the status quo, but also what others are doing to turn the normal upside down. One eye sees the oppressed reality, the other sees the resistant one. Exercising double vision is a way of rejecting the reality of the systems of dehumanization as true, even when these rule our lives, even from the inside. To reject them is not to diminish one's senses of its power, but it is a call not to be consumed by it. Resistance and healing need liminal spaces. Moves to this space require we shift to see people under difficult circumstances as active and as trying to do what they can. Often, it is easier to see helpless victims who must be saved and not notice how they are resisting oppression in small, quiet ways or in large ways that get reinterpreted in mainstream common sense as absurd, which is what Alexa experienced in her attempt to join the GUARD. Recognizing and affirming the diverse strategies that people use in the face of oppression is part of creating political solidarity. When we begin to see how others resist on multiple fronts, we begin to find companion travelers with whom we can seek solidarity and healing. It is this emphasis on practice, living, love, and renewal that is central to the political ecologies of healing that I highlight here. I've used border theories to unlearn categorical thinking in my own work and to see humans in construction where it has been denied. Alexa, Manuela, Alicia show us that sometimes it is not how far one moves, but how one moves, within what complexities and against what simplifications of histories, geographies, and desires. Societies in the Americas have for a long time countered the intersections of colonialism, extractive capitalism, and patriarchy. When struggling against categorical boundaries, people use their voice to speak a new reality into existence. Reexistencia, sanación, adaptation, diplomacy, bifurcation, emancipation are also verbs of healing that travel alongside damage-centered narratives. Venas Abiertas is in good company and does not need to do all the remembering alone. Sustos, wounds, traumas that split us and scatter our energies and haunt us also open space for the movement of healing in relation to multiple coexisting violences against self-affirmation. Healing is practice, not a destination. I offer these reflections as an invitation to not only theorize with healing, but to center it in our retelling of political economic cycles and transformations in the region, and in how we research, advocate, and teach to transgress and remember the Americas. Thank you.
Gabriela. I like the talk, was very inspiring. I especially like the turn from documenting wounds and harm to documenting healing. We should open up for questions. If anybody has a question, directly to Gabriela, or I can start. I have lots of questions, so break the ice. So I think I want to go back to the first part, and because it's something that it really I can't come to terms with, and so maybe you can help me understand, help us understand that. So Ecuador was, 2008 was at the forefront of environmental rights in the Constitution, right? So, but then it seems, right, as you showed, that's what happened. It's actually financed and intensified development policies and its infrastructures of oil and extractivism, while on the other hand, it was introducing the rights of nature in the Constitution, right? So how do these two narratives and practices coexist since 2008, right? So one can praise on one hand the Constitution of Ecuador, but then it seems, right, in the practice, the state this is not carrying out the.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and there were a few slides that I took out because I knew this was going to be really long. But I think that the same assumption about the homogeneity and fixity of the state, of identity, is happening in relation to the state. We kind of think about the state when we look closely, we see it's actually quite fragmented, and it is constituted by a push and pull of different interests that are located in different institutions of governance. So, for example, you have the Ministry of the Environment, and that is influenced by a lot of the work that Alberto Acosta did in terms of thinking about the rights of nature and degrowth, and sort of a logic of environmental ethic that is part of the state logic, and it is part of what became the lobbying ground for the redrawing of the Constitution of 2008 with the Montecristi meetings. And also that was inspired by the uprisings that were happening from the Amazon as well. and the idea that a new kind of refounding of the state needed to happen. At the same time, you have a political economic structure that is set in place with a hierarchical organization of state and a Congress that is polyvocal and an economy that is based on an extractive imperative, the kind of extractive imperative that Galeano describes. You know, it's about the taking from the spaces of land, the taking from rivers, taking from mountains, as a way to convert that into an alchemy of social spending and programming upward social mobility. That is still the logic of extraction, is at the core of financing any kind of change that we can think about. And so one of the proposals that came out during the Revolución Ciudadana, also shaped by the thinking of Alberto Acosta and other environmental organizations, such as Acción Ecológica, is that how about we switch the story and we say, if the world and the international community really values the biodiversity and the presence of Amazonian spaces, how about the international community finance our development needs, and we keep oil in the soil, right? So this was the initiative that took off in 2007 with the Yasuni Initiative, Yasuni Initiative. The Yasuni is one of the largest biosphere reserves in the Amazon area, and it is recognized for its high biodiversity as well as the diverse presence of indigenous peoples, including peoples who live in voluntary isolation. Voluntary isolation is a misnomer. Really, it is a group of Waorani peoples who decided they were not going to recognize that they did not see the state as a force, as a legal force, or as a powerful presence, and then they decided not to be participants in the Ecuadorian society. So we have this intersection of peoples living in voluntary isolation or not recognizing the Ecuadorian state. We have the Yasuni area with its high biodiversity. And we have the presence of 3 fields, the Itete fields, which hold the largest reserves of oil proven reserves of oil remaining in Ecuador, the largest ones. And so ecological movements and President Correa at that time set out this proposal. Let's keep the oil in the soil. Let's have the international community pay for what they say they value. It completely failed. I think only Germany provided some funds, and none of the remaining international community wanted to follow the setup that the Ecuadorian government had put in place. Instead, they wanted to keep the funds to be held elsewhere where Ecuador could not have direct access to. And so Rafael Correa decided, okay, the international community is not ready to put their money where the money where their mouth is. I mean, I think that's the expression. And so put these oil concessions up for bidding. In retrospect, it is very possible that the government of Rafael Correa already knew that this was going to be the outcome because of the fragmented ways in which the state works and because of this very deep structure of extractive imperative that is in place. But nonetheless, the idea of imagining and speculating what would happen was always a potential, right? It was always a possibility that the international community might act in a way that was not expected, and this might have been a potential unprecedented way of keeping environmental promises in place. I don't know if it's a matter of contradictions or paradoxes. I think it is a matter of understanding the Ecuadorian state as a fragmented space with these multiple interests pulling in different directions. And that is why it seems incommensurable in some ways, but it is how a state works. And it's not only Ecuador. You would see it it's also, we can see it in the United States as well, in terms of the EPA, for example. But it makes it for a very difficult space to sort out what oppression-resistance relations are and how to align ourselves in terms of advocacy when we know that the political economic structures work in a particular way. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can hear me. Yes. I want to thank you for a wonderful lecture, very comprehensive, very informative of what is happening in that part of the world. I have a question. I have sort of like a doubt about the concept of healing at a time when we need to fight, not heal. I mean, healing probably would happen once we find that we're being hurt. But I don't know, I wanted you to explain a little bit like the relationship between the fight that needs to be constant and healing. How does that take place at the same time?
That's a great question. And I think part of what informs my thinking about this is not only decolonial thought, but also Black feminist thought from the North, also from the US, for example, where there's a constancy. The fights are, fighting takes energy. Fight is giving. And there isn't a lot of pouring back when we fight. When we are in fight, we're in a constant state of vibration that robs us of our vitality. And I think in terms of how activism is often conceptualized, is about a constant confrontation with an oppressive system. And there's desgaste. That's the word I'm looking for, and I don't know what the English word is for that. But there's a constant desgaste with the fight. And you can see that. I mean, there's evidence in terms of when you speak with organizers or when you speak with people who are in the front lines, like Alexandra, there's a constant desgaste of their energy, of their expenditure. And so what we need to think in order to maintain this fight, I'm not saying heal instead of fighting, but I'm saying that a process of healing, of communal healing, needs to be part there to pour into the energies of those who are doing this frontline fighting. Like I said, healing is a practice, it's not a destination. And I think we often think about wounds and healing as the wound will close and it's done. But what does the closing is the fight, yeah? But the healing is what maintains the fighting. And so if we don't address the multiple and intersectional oppressions that people are experiencing, people like Alexandra are experiencing, with a deep embedded form of patriarchy in the very community that sustains her. And so these oppressions are like the little cuts that people experience and exhaust them, that los desgastan. Then you can't have fighters, right? You will see even, and it's not just Ecuador, you can see it in environmental fights here in the United States, the desgaste that they experience, they burn out, there's burnout, that's what it is. And so how do you sustain those who can use their voices to speak out new realities and different realities? How do we sustain what is our responsibility towards them? Is to develop these communities and practices of healing so that they can keep the fight too. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for, again, very thorough explanation. I am interested in the theoretical frame and the concept you present of sacrifice zones. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you have also thought this as a historical concept. Mm-hmm. And when I think of sacrifice, religion comes to mind, right? And the connection with coloniality, Christianity, and how deeply embedded it is in the nation state, who has to be sacrificed in order for progress. And the second part, and I think that connects to the good neighbor. The good neighbor gives up his land. The good neighbor sacrifices himself. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking in Peru, there is a stigma against people who are against mining. Like it's the opposite of what we would think. In Peru, if you are against mining, you are against progress.
Yeah, Peru es un país minero.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So and it connects a lot to my own work. So yeah, you can expand on that.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk to you about your work. So the question of sacrifice as in a historical perspective, right?
Is that as part of coloniality?
Okay.
Christianity.
Interesting. So I'm not a historian, and so I don't often think in I don't often think with the colonial period, so I don't know how satisfying my answer would be. The concept of sacrifice that I've been using is more along the lines of what Giorgio Agamben uses in terms of the sacred body, right? The sacred, as sort of this space of is a space of non-human, a space of like that can be imbued with meaning for the social, right? And so it's a space of bare life. And I think in some ways that has helped me think through sacrifice zones, which is actually a term that environmental justice scholars use in terms of what can be devalued and not really affect the public good, right? Or not affect the greater citizenry. And for something to qualify as that, it needs to be something that is perceived as already extinct, which is one of the ways in which a lot of the rhetoric frames indigenous peoples as sort of like relics or remnants of a society that is past but is no longer in the present. Even though there are people in the present, their cultures are, their civilizations are perceived as like already dead or dying, right? Eliminated or absorbed. And so that is where, to me, that's where the connection is with these, with sacrifice spaces in terms of the oil complex. I have not explored it as sacred in terms of religious significance, but I can see how that could be connected because the state sort of acts in this form as a governance entity that decides what is best for others, right? And it's performed through its patriarchy, but also performed through its racist views on elimination of people from spaces. Yeah.
We're sort of, maybe we can continue.
Will you get coffee?
Should we all have coffee?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. We'll go to the coffee room,
Okay.
have coffee, and you could ask Rasha.
Okay.
Yeah, or do you want
No, it's okay.
to go for it?
It's okay.
Go for it.
Do you want to just ask it and then I can think about it?
Okay.
We're all here.
I love questions.
So one question, and I'm glad you actually brought up the non-human component in the answer. So Jana Brown, who studies utopia studies, talks about how blacks were never envisioned as human and black women were never envisioned as women. So when we're talking about blackness or envisioning the future or the utopia of blackness, we don't have to lean into the human component, we can lean into this non-human component. So I wanted you to kind of expound on the indigenous terminology of non-human, and when you were experiencing that non-human interaction, what did that afford for you, or what does that mean? Can you just unpack a little bit the non-human component?
Oh my gosh, yeah, to be seen as a non-person. Or to be known as a non-person, or to be told that I'm a non-person in a space where I'm coming from a space of privilege, right? And so to be denied that humanity in a space where I've been taking that for granted. That was transformative. And it wasn't, but what is, I'm just thinking through the question, right? One of the things that was transformative about it is that it didn't feel like an insult in that particular space because we were in a journey together. And so to be challenged in my assumption that I value because I am, was a way of opening up and think through the categorical framings, and to think about my own actions as an advocate, in which there's all these elements of moves to innocence in that space, right? Like this makes me a good person because I'm doing this in the favor of other people, but not necessarily questioning whether that valuation was more for me than it is for others, right? And so that, in a way, I think connects with your question about, I don't know about the non-human, but about not being human. Because I think, and I experience this a lot in the classroom, and that's why I closed with in how we do research and how we teach about the Americas, because I experience it in the sense that people want to do good and they want to be good people, right? But what that means is determined by my cultural grounding, and not necessarily the cultural grounding of those that I see as the objects of my help, right? And so that to me was particularly present in Esmeraldas when I showed those slides of Esmeraldas and this question of the good neighbor, and like we were ready to say, well, the evidence is here, the refinery is absolutely a terrible neighbor to how we should, everybody should be uprising against the refinery. And some people were like, absolutely. And some people were like, no, we're not doing that. Because part of what makes me human is being able to feel the joy of being at a party and having my green space and having the celebration that I want to have with my kids, because that's where my humanity is, right? And sort of how to counter that, my conception of humanity versus the conception of humanity of others, and the incommensurability of those in my head. It's incommensurable in my head, right? Because I come with a colonial perspective, because I'm a white settler in that space, and sort of coming to terms with what that is, identifying that in your self-awareness is part of the transformational process that we experienced there.